it shows up everywhere, okay? So people are starting to make them themselves. They're kind of moving out of just the spiritualist, and it's falling into pop culture. So it's called the New Planchette. And if you look at it, it looks pretty much like a Ouija board, right? Problem is, the Ouija board isn't named until 1890, so we're 4 years before Ouija proper. Now, here's an early example of a talking board, and this is a homemade board that someone made, and you can see how they did it. It does not look like a Ouija board, which people think of as the arcs. And these were things people made out of breadboards. You know, anything you made yourself were things you had in your house, you know? And so, how many people knew that a witch board made it into the White House in 1886? No, right? A couple people. So a company from my home state called the W.S. Reed Toy Company made a witch board. We don't know if they made a bunch or whether they just made one. And he sent it to the President of the United States, President Grover Cleveland, for a wedding gift. And he sends the letter to the Boston Globe. Now, you kind of think about it, like, when I write a letter to the president, I don't CC the Boston Globe, right? So he's clearly, you know, trying to get some attention here, and he sends them this gift. And actually, the president writes back that he received it in the White House, but he doesn't think he'll be consulting it for any questions on past, present, future anytime soon. So we don't know if he used it, but we know one got there. And unfortunately, we just have a description of it, we haven't found it. I've worked with the National Archives, the White House, the Library of Congress. Everyone is looking for some other record of it, and hopefully someday it pops up. So here's kind of two important people to the story. Charles Kennard and E.C. Resch. These are two gentlemen who both claimed to invent the board that would become Ouija in Chestertown. How many people have been to Chestertown? It's a beautiful little town. It's very upscale. It almost like, it's very New England-y to me looking. It's a great tourist thing. And so Charles Kennard claims that he was sitting in his kitchen of his new house. He let his mind go blank. He turned over a breadboard, flipped over a teacup, and his hand just started moving it around. And that's where he came up with the idea. Now, there's a problem with this a little bit because this story of the talking board we trace back to January of 1886. But he doesn't have his new house built until June. So it's a little bit of a problem. This story was also printed in the Chestertown Transcript and the Kent County News. So many people would claim to invent the Ouija board, and we think basically they invented it as they were flipping through the paper, right? They read the story, kind of play around with it. But Charles Kennard says he invented it, and that he takes it to his next door neighbor in his office, E.C. Resch. And by the way, this we know is a picture of Charles Kennard, and I'll tell you why, because we actually have a descendant of Charles Kennard in the audience who gave me this picture, but we'll get to that in a minute. This picture of E.C. Resch was found by descendants of E.C. Resch who believe this to be him. So we're not 100% sure, but it matches a description that was given to them as to who he is. So we'll just keep going until we find that out. So Charles Kennard brings it to E.C. Resch. E.C. Resch is a coffin maker, an undertaker. He makes musical instruments. He's just one of those guys who can create things and build things. And they make about a dozen, according to Kennard. And they shop them around town. And according to Kennard, everyone loves it. They're having fun. Kennard sees the future in this. He's a capitalist. He likes to do lots of different businesses, and he thinks we can make money on it. So he asks E.C. Resch to go into business. And E.C. Resch does not see the future in this. He sees the future in all the other things he's doing. And because you can make them yourself, why would anyone buy them? So he says, according to Kennard, no thanks. Kennard moves to Baltimore, takes the idea with him, starts a company. Now, later on, E.C. Resch's son would say, that's not true. That it was actually E.C. Resch who came up with the idea, and that he debuted it at a Judge Wick's house. Well, Judge Wick's was an incredibly powerful man in Maryland. He was the judge that oversaw everything. And he was also Charles Kennard's father-in-law. So he says that he debuted this board at a party at Judge Wick's father-in-law's house, and that's where Kennard first saw it. And that would come back a little bit later. But what I want to show you is, so here we are. This is LaVale Kennard, and I took this picture when I found her in 2013. There's a bit of a story. So she found the only photograph that we have of Charles Kennard, like real photograph, not just in the newspaper. Now what's funny about this is I came real close in 2007. 2007, Gene Orlando shared with me an article that had been written in the Warfield, Baltimore's Warfield magazine. And these two authors researched the story of the Ouija board a little bit. And in it, they talked and interviewed Edward Kennard. So Charles Kennard was married twice. And his second family, his son was still alive. And he talked a little bit about what he knew. And he was very little when his father died. So, you know, you take family stories, oh, they're great, and you have to prove them. So, you know, I call up. I'm like, oh my God, I gotta call this guy, right? So I call up, and a woman answers the phone, and I say, can I please speak to Edward Kennard? And his long pause, is this a joke? And no, there's no joke at all. I read an article that he was interviewed for, and I'd really like to talk to him. To which I got, this is pretty sick, he died 2 weeks ago, click. So yeah, okay, newbie mistake. Check to see if the person you want to talk to is alive before you call their house. And I was a real newbie, I really had no idea what I was doing. You know, I wait a week, I leave this incredible apology on the voicemail. I'm so sorry, I didn't know, and you know, if you could call me back, that would be great. And a couple days later, I got a call back from his ex-wife. So his ex-wife was actually in the house helping to clean up his estate. And she said to me, no problem, I was just in a bad place, you know, I get it. And we talked a little bit, and she said, there's tons of stuff from his father here. And we didn't have any kids, so if there's anything that you want, I'll just box it all up and put it together. Awesome, right? So cool. How many answers are probably in those boxes? I'm excited. So 2 weeks later, I get this frantic call and a voicemail. I am so sorry, oh my God, I can't believe this. I was putting everything in boxes together with you, and I put everything on the front porch, and to the right was your stuff. To the left was everything that was going to Goodwill. I went to the grocery store, Goodwill came, took everything. She said she called up immediately. They said, oh, we've already tossed everything that wasn't of value, sorry, gone. So, boom. So that's, you know, we're going back. So that's 1997. And I'm like horrified, oh my God. Fast forward, 2013. In this research, there's often pieces of the puzzle you just can't solve. And so you try to look at it, and then you put it aside. And I try to keep notes on how I look at things. It sounds silly and nerdy, but I'm a nerd. So I take them out and look at them differently. And I know Charles Kennard had a first family, so I know his second family is gone, that's it. But the first family were also buried in Druid Ridge Cemetery here in Maryland. And I had those cemetery records. And I'm looking at them, and they're important because you can find the last person who paid for a plot, and then you can try to find them. But genealogy is tough, because if someone has a girl, their name changes when they get married. That's a problem. If you don't know when or who they got married to, right? So you have to find the wedding announcements and stuff. So I found one person. There was this person who was there, the great-granddaughter, it looked like, from what I could put together, but she disappears. And then I realized, maybe I'm looking at this wrong, because suddenly her name changes in the documents. So I look at the name and think, wait a minute, is this the same person? I've never looked under this name, LaVale. And I search, bingo. This person happens to live right outside of Baltimore, boom. So I leave a voicemail, and you know, I'm better, right? Like, I've learned a lot since, you know, calling people who I know or not. You know, I try to make sure they're alive first, and you know, so I leave a voicemail. I start leaving the voicemail, and the person picks up the phone and says, yes, I am who you're saying, and I haven't heard those names in a long time. So bingo. So LaVale, you can raise your hand. She's in the audience right here. This is the last known living descendant of Charles Kennard. And that started a friendship, and I don't know why, because if you look at me here, why would you want to be friends with this if you look like this? So it's fascinating talking to her because she hadn't been told that Charles Kennard had anything to do with the Ouija board. The first family, his first wife, they didn't care or disliked or for whatever reason didn't pass this down. And she started digging through stuff and found that photo that I showed you before. Now, what's interesting about that photo was that was a gift to, from Edward Kennard to his half-sister, Adelaide, and it was sent to her, I think in the 70s, 66, okay, there we go. And if that hadn't been given to her, it would have been tossed out in the trash when everything went into Goodwill. So I thought I had lost everything, and yet ironically, because he had given this picture to his half-sister, it stayed. The chances of this happening to me are just crazy. And you know, LaVale is great. I'm sure you guys will talk to her later. She has an interesting take on the whole thing, and we've been talking. She's been able to fill in a lot of blanks because her family side kept a detailed history of the Kennards. And she gave this amazing present that was given in Christmas by her great aunt, right? Yeah, great aunt Adelaide. So it would have been Charles Kennard's sister, wrote an entire history about everything. Now, what's really cool is you would think, because Charles Kennard claimed to invent the Ouija board, spent his whole life talking about it, came up with many boards afterwards, which we'll explore, you would think they would talk about it. So interestingly enough, they say he was in the fertilizer business, and he was very successful. And then he decided to go into something else for a while. And then he went into real estate. Now that he went into something else for a while is the time he was doing the Ouija board. And so that's what the family thought of that, for some reason, we don't know why. But thanks to LaVale, and as you'll hear many different families, this history is saved because this is all gone. As Gene and I know, and the other collectors and the other directors out there, so much of this was just lost. And it's only 125 years. We're not talking like thousands of years, right? So here's something else. In 2013 was a great year for Ouija board discoveries. I also tracked down, it took 20-something years, a descendant of E.C. Resch. Now, this was tough because only his daughters had kids, and then those daughters had daughters, and they all got married and changed names, and I was able to track down a relative. And he told me, yes, they had heard that E.C. Resch had invented the Ouija board, and that he never thought anything of it because he was told by his Uncle Bill. And he called him Crazy Uncle Bill. And I'm like, oh, I guess everyone's got a crazy uncle, right? Like I do. But I was like listening to him and thought, well, I don't know, if someone told me my family member had something to do with the Ouija board, I might investigate it. And he was like, no. Let me explain Crazy Uncle Bill. Crazy Uncle Bill was bothered by flies in his pants, zippers, right? He zippered himself once and didn't want to do it again. Any guy in the audience knows what I'm talking about. Now, what he did was he cut out all the zippers in his pants and put in pins. Now, I would never put a pin down here. Again, men would know what we're talking about. So he says to me, okay, Walter's like, that's Crazy Uncle Bill. So Crazy Uncle Bill's putting pins down his pants. I didn't really believe in anything he said. So there you go. So I meet him, and he gives me some interesting research that shows that his grandmother wrote about E.C. Resch that showed a lot of the things that we did, talking about a tin type, describing it, which matches the tin type that was found by his cousin. So what I'm holding here is a little cane that has the inscription of his son. So E.C. Resch made that cane according to the family, and for his son, and he gave me that. So again, I'm a collector of these people's things in their lives. So we'll get into this. Like, what is a Ouija board? A Ouija board is a talking board, right? What's a talking board? A talking board has letters and numbers and symbols and words yes and no and goodbye. And a planchette that you put on top, or an indicator. You ask a question, and mysteriously the planchette moves across the board, spelling out the answer, right? Other general terms, we heard one spirit board, witch boards, we've all heard these before. Hasbro would like you to know that Ouija is a trademark, so is Mystifying Oracle, and they own them. And they are trademarks that have been, Ouija is a trademark that's been in use since 1890. How do you pronounce it? How many people say Ouija? How many people say Ouija? Awesome. You're both right, yay. I love it when no one's wrong. Originally, it was pronounced Ouija. By the 1920s, we see reports in newspapers of people Ouijaing. And all of a sudden, people are saying Ouija. So quickly, the manufacturers put on, whether you pronounce it Ouija or Ouija, it's still fun. So they don't care, right? The company doesn't care how you pronounce it as long as you buy it. So here we go. So what does the word Ouija mean? How many people heard before that Ouija was a combination of the French and German words oui and ja? Yeah, that's what we all thought, really. And potentially it might be true, except we find some articles from 1919 where Charles Kennard and the other originators all tell their story about how it all began. Now, problem with these stories are, it's 30 years after the fact, right? So these people, and you know, when you tell a story about you want to be the best part of the story, right? So you're going to make your part bigger. In your eyes, it's bigger. So all these people had huge contributions. Well, who knows? But one of the things they all agree on was how it happened, like how it got its name. So here we go. Helen Peters Nosworthy, another interesting story that just happened a couple years ago. In these letters, Charles Kennard talks about Elijah Bond's sister-in-law, who's described as a great medium, right? Strong medium. And she's not listed anywhere. Like Brandon researches all of these mediums. She's not in any book that said, ooh, mediums, Helen Peters. Like she doesn't show up anywhere. And they talk about how they were sitting around the board one night. They asked it what it wanted to be called, and it spelled out Ouija. And when they asked what that meant, the board answered, good luck. Now, there was born Ouija, the Egyptian luck board. Now, why Egyptian, right? Well, around 1890, there's some interesting discoveries in Egypt. And that's far away in 1890 from the United States. And so Egypt is mystical. And as you'll see as you go through the museum, every decade, as America discovers what's mystical next, those influences make their ways into the graphics of these great talking boards. So at this time, Egypt, right? Well, after it names it, Helen Peters takes out her locket and shows at the end of it there's an image of a woman and the word Ouija on there. Now, so we'll stop for a second. How can there be a word on a locket that didn't exist before? We don't know. Potentially, it's an image of Ouida, who was a famous authoress at the time, who wrote books that women would read. So she could have been a Ouija supporter. But she says, okay, look at this. Charles Kennard, he's also, he's not a diehard believer. He uses his brain. And he says, were you thinking about this when it spelled it out? And she says, no. Good enough for him. They've got the name. Now, this is perfect because up until 2 or 3 years ago, we believed the Ouija board only had a bunch of dads, fathers. Well, suddenly there's this woman involved. And what happens with her, right? Because no one's ever heard of her. She falls out of history. Well, we kind of all get together and we try to figure out which sister-in-law this is. Who is Helen Peters? And we figure it out. She gets married. She goes to London for a while. Then she moves to Denver. Well, when she goes to Denver, she adopts a daughter who has a son. And a couple years ago, I found that grandson, and he said, I call him up, ask about Helen Peters Nosworthy, her maiden name. He said, no one has ever called and asked me about Mom and Pop Nosworthy, and why are you so interested in her? I say, well, okay, she may have something to do with the Ouija board. He said, something to do with the Ouija board. She named it and she helped patent it. So according to him, which is also in the patent documents, that when Ouijacon went to patent the Ouija board, the patent office was like, I don't know if we want to prove that really, because we can't prove how it works, and you know. So they say you have to come to Washington, D.C. and prove it. Ouijacon takes Helen Peters, according to this Peters descendant, and they sit at the office and they ask, okay, like here, let's demonstrate it. And clerk after clerk is like, I don't know really, I don't want to put my name. It goes all the way to the chief clerk. The chief clerk, according to this story, is annoyed, like, oh, God, I didn't, I'm all the way up here and I'm having to do this little job. So he walks in, according to them, and says, okay, look, if this contraption can spell out my name, and you don't know me and I don't know you, you've got your patent. According to the story, Helen Peters at the board spells out his name. He gets up, turns ghost white, and says, you've got your patent. It's a great story. Is it true? Who knows, right? These people are all telling great stories. It's awesome. So now what's really cool is I go to Ohio. I told you I was going to take you on this journey, so imagine going to Ohio. So I'm going to preface this, right? So I'm Jewish, I'm gay, I like Ouija boards. Holy trinity of evil. I say that because Helen Peters' grandson is a Jehovah's Witness. Jehovah's Witnesses are not keen on the Ouija board. In fact, they believe that the Ouija board is a tool of the devil, and that only demons talk through it. So I'm thinking, this guy's never going to tell me his story. Really unique, really interesting man, and you'll see a picture of him in a minute. He actually told us the story and the history because even though he was against it, he believed this was his grandmother's story and that it should be told. So why did Helen Peters get erased from Ouija board history? And his story answers that. Sometime after the Ouija board was named, we know that Helen Peters was a stockholder in the company. So pretty interesting for a woman of the time. But she plays a major role, right? Like she gives it its name, she helps get it patented, she's there. Well, the family, her family is a well-to-do family in Baltimore and owned property in Virginia. And when she was young, the Civil War, according to the family, there were some battles fought on their property. And there were a lot of dead soldiers. Well, it sounds morbid today, but they went around, her family members, and took off buttons from the uniforms of the dead soldiers. And they had this great collection of Civil War buttons. And suddenly, some of them go missing. And the Peters family says, well, we can solve this. Let's use the Ouija board and ask. They ask the Ouija board. It spells out a name of someone in the family. Half the family believes it, half the family doesn't. Helen Peters being on the side that does not believe that the Ouija board is telling the truth. It causes a feud in the family that existed to the day she died. That's why she did not come back to Baltimore. She went to Denver. And she, to her dying day, told everyone after that, don't buy the Ouija board, don't play the Ouija board, it lies. So not the same reason that other people today say don't play the Ouija board, but to her it was personal. It broke her family. And as you'll see, it broke a few other people's families as well. But when I went to visit them,